Hello, welcome back. We're going to go over Chapter 8 in this video. Chapter 8 covers photosynthesis, so let's go ahead and get started. So these are the objectives of Section 1. There are 3 sections in this chapter. Section 1, we're just going to do an overview of photosynthesis. So hopefully by the end of this section, you can explain the significance of photosynthesis to all living organisms. Hopefully you can describe the main structures involved in photosynthesis and identify the substrates and the products. So the reactants and the products of photosynthesis. Okay, so the importance of photosynthesis, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs create their own food. Heterotrophs have to seek out their own food. They can't create it themselves, so they have to eat. So autotrophs are the ones that we are going to be concerned with this chapter, but autotrophs are important to the entire world. So there are 2 types of autotrophs. One is photoautotroph, which we are very familiar with. This is like all the plants that we can see. They use sunlight, the energy from the sun, to create organic compounds, which is their food. So they create things like glucose, like sugars. They include plants, algae, cyanobacteria. So plants, algae here, cyanobacteria. Chemiautotrophs create compounds, but they don't use the energy from the sun. They use energy from other inorganic compounds. So things that are surrounding these black smokers, which are at the bottom of the ocean away from any sunlight. They use the energy in the compounds in this black smoke. It's not smoke, but it's really dense minerals, and they use that energy to create food. So instead of sunlight, it's the stuff in here. So autotrophs are extremely important to heterotrophs. A lot of heterotrophs consume plant matter. Heterotrophs are things like animals, fungi, bacteria. They rely on other organisms so that they can eat them. So like these deer, they would be heterotrophs. They would actually be herbivores, right? So they rely on plants to do photosynthesis so that they can reap the benefits of those plants. So a predator that eats the deer, though, however, they would be a carnivore, so they would eat meat, right? All right, so if something, well, something to consider here is just a plant in general. So where are these reactants of photosynthesis coming into play, and where are the products being made? So this is a very simplified overview of photosynthesis, just looking at this one tree. Photosynthesis uses solar energy. So the above ground portions, typically the green portions, not the brown portions, are going to capture sunlight. And that is where our sugars are going to be made. Where the sugars are made and where the sunlight is being captured is where carbon dioxide will also be absorbed. And then oxygen is given off as a byproduct. Now, water has to come in through the roots. So all the way down here underground is where water comes in. But the other, let's see. So can we pick out the reactants of photosynthesis? Do we remember what the reactants are? It is carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water. So these would be the 3 things needed for photosynthesis. And then the products, sugar and oxygen. So that sugar that will be made is going to go to where? The mitochondria, right? So cellular respiration will break that sugar down and release the ATP from it, or capture energy in ATP from that sugar. So because plants can't go out and eat food like we can, they have to do photosynthesis to make their sugar so that they can do cellular respiration. Okay, so this is a really neat video that talks about Yellowstone. So Yellowstone is a national park in the Midwest, and it is called like a super volcano. There is a lot of magma close to the surface underground at Yellowstone, and so there's a lot of like hot geysers and hot pools of water. But a lot of people speculate that one day Yellowstone could erupt and create this huge volcano with this huge ash cloud. So, if this volcanic eruption happened and this ash blocked out the sun, what would happen in terms of photosynthesis? It would stop, right? So plants would likely die, and if the plants are dying, the herbivores, the heterotrophs, the herbivores are not going to be able to eat. And then the carnivores are not going to be able to eat either because they rely on herbivores for their food. So plants, I know you might be thinking like, why are we learning about plants? They're really important. You consume them on a daily basis, I hope. But the ecosystem as a whole relies on plants. All right, so here is the photosynthesis equation reaction. So yes, it's in a very simplified, nice form, but as we know, it does not happen in a nice, just one-step manner. There's a lot of steps that go on. So there are two metabolic pathways of photosynthesis. There's the light reaction and the Kelvin cycle. So if we think back to cellular respiration had what, 4 different pathways to go through, but photosynthesis just has 2. So yay, it's a little bit more simple. So here's our carbon dioxide, water, sunlight. So these are the 3 things needed, and then sugar and oxygen are created. So notice that this equation down here is balanced. So there are 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules needed to create 1 sugar molecule. And then there's 6 oxygens as a byproduct. Okay, so let's take a look at a leaf really quick. So the leaf of plants, whether it looks like this, or it might be like a blade of grass or a pine needle, they have specialized cells inside of the leaf. And so those specialized cells that are in the center, which are protected from the exterior environment, so these ones in the center of the leaf are the ones that are going to do photosynthesis. So CO2, carbon dioxide, will enter in through these openings called stoma, and they will diffuse into these empty spaces here, and they will be taken up by the cells here. Water comes in through the roots. So water is going to actually travel up this xylem tissue. Xylem is a type of transport tissue, kind of like a blood vessel. So it's like the blood vessel of a plant. It takes water from the roots up to parts of the plant that are above ground. So water is going to come in from the xylem. It'll diffuse outward to the nearby cells. And then what else do we need? We need sunlight, right? So sunlight is going to have to penetrate this upper kind of like dead layer. You can think of it as like your skin. So your skin has a lot of like hard dead cells on the exteriors. Well, so do plant leaves. So the sunlight's going to penetrate through that exterior, and it will activate the pigment molecules in the cells here in this middle layer. Okay, so let's do a poll question. What 2 major products result from photosynthesis? Well, hopefully you said letter C, sugar and oxygen. So these are the products. So can we pick out the reactants? Can we pick out the reactants? There's not a letter for that, but it's carbon dioxide and then water, which is not listed here. Okay, so I have some worksheets on Moodle, but you're welcome to just screenshot this and print them for yourself. We are going to take a look at this graphic organizer throughout the entire video. We'll keep coming back to it and filling it in as we go. And we're going to look at this here in just a second. All right, so let's look at a chloroplast. So chloroplasts, remember, are just part of the plant cell. So they're small. This is what one looks like close up. And they are typically green. So this is a cell here. You can see how many little chloroplasts are inside of it. So a lot. So it's not usually just like, what, 5 in this picture. There's a lot usually. So one chloroplast looks like this. There is a double membrane here, and then there are other membranes inside of the chloroplast. So there's an outer membrane, inner membrane. There's the stroma, which is the empty space. This is where one of the reactions takes place. And then there's the granum, which is a stack of thylakoids. So each of the thylakoids are, like, I like to call them pancakes. So a granum is a stack of pancakes. Thylakoids are interconnected, so I know they don't really look like they're connected in this picture, but they are connected, typically like this one's showing. Thylakoids are where the pigment is going to be. So chlorophyll typically is our pigment, and it'll be in the thylakoid membrane. The highest densities of chloroplast occur in the middle of the leaf. So remember our middle of the leaf picture here. So these cells are going to have a lot of chloroplasts. The cells on the outside, not so much because they're just for protection. And then these cells, if you think back to what I said earlier, are like a blood vessel. So they're not going to have really any chloroplasts in them because that's not what they're supposed to do. So the middle layers are going to have the most chloroplasts. Okay. So let's take a look at our chloroplast picture. Can we fill in the blanks here, A, B, C, D, E, F, with the correct names? And I know I didn't give you a word bank, but I think you could do it. So if you want to pause here before I tell you what the answers are. All right, so A is the outer membrane. B is granum, so it's referring to the stack. C is the lumen, so that's the space inside of a thylakoid. D is the inner membrane. Letter E is the stroma, S-T-R-O-M-A. And then each of these that the arrow is pointing to are a thylakoid. All right, so now that we know what these things are, it might be helpful for you to draw one of these in your notes and label it, and then that way you'll have something to refer back to if you don't want to print it. So which statement about thylakoids and eukaryotes is not correct? So let's pick out the one that's incorrect, and then we'll look at the ones that are correct. So letter A is the incorrect answer. So if we switched granum and thylakoid, that would make this answer correct. So thylakoids are assembled into stacks called granum. Okay. Thylakoids do exist as a maze of folded membranes. The space surrounding thylakoids is called the stroma, which was the letter E. And then thylakoids contain our chlorophyll pigment. All right, so let's take a look at our graphic organizer. We're going to fill in this box here and this box here. So just this line of boxes. So photosynthesis occurs in the cells of the what? It occurs in the cells, use your word bank down here, of the leaf, right? It occurs in the cells of the leaf. It is specifically in the chloroplasts which contain pigments that absorb light. So leaf should go here, and then light will go here. All right, so let's keep that in mind. There we go. Let's keep that in mind as we move through this next part. And then we'll come back to our graphic organizer again and fill in some more blanks. All right, so that was 8.1. We're going to move on to 8.2, which is the light-dependent reactions, the light reactions. We're going to talk about how plants absorb energy from sunlight. We'll describe what wavelengths of light are and how there's different wavelengths, and describe how and where photosynthesis takes place. Okay, so here's a nice overview again of photosynthesis. So if this is a chloroplast, right, here's the double membrane, the outer membrane, the inner membrane, here's the stroma, here's a thylakoid, and then a stack of thylakoids is a granum. This is a granum here. Where these reactants of photosynthesis are going to come into play, light and water are going to be needed for the light reaction, okay? So the light reaction. They are also going to need some oxidized versions of electron carriers, which is this one, and the energy creator, which is this one. So the light reaction takes place on the granum and the thylakoids. So we're going to take a look at this light reaction as we move through the next few slides, okay? All right, so the light reaction converts light energy to chemical energy. So let's break that statement down because that might confuse you. Light energy, which is coming from the sun, is going to be converted into chemical energy, which is ATP and NADPH. So these are chemicals, right? They're molecules, so they're chemicals. So we're taking energy from the sun and making reduced molecules. That means they have electrons on them, means they have higher energy. So that occurs on the thylakoid membrane. And then the other reactions, which we're going to talk about later, is the Kelvin cycle, which happens independent of light. But it does need some of the products that the light reaction produces to go forth. Okay. So, in which compartment of the plant cell do the light-independent reactions of photosynthesis take place? Light-independent is the Kelvin cycle, so it should be B, the stroma. Good job if you got that right. All right, so what is light energy, right? So what is this energy that's coming from the sun? So the sun puts out what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. So it puts out a lot of different wavelengths at one time. And we can only see a small portion of those wavelengths, which we call visible light. And it ranges in rainbow colors, right? So that's the visible light that we can see. There's a lot of other wavelengths that we don't see, but we can use to our advantage. So infrared, I'm sure you've seen video cameras that use infrared light. It's really good for seeing at nighttime. Radio wavelengths, so we use those for radio. Then there's UV, which is used like for sterilizing things. UV rays are detrimental to your skin. They can cause cancer. X-rays, I think you can guess what that one's used for. And then there's things that the sun can produce gamma rays, which are extremely harmful. And when like nuclear reactors melt down, they can release gamma rays and cause radiation burns. So gamma rays are extremely harmful for us. X-rays are harmful if not used correctly. UV rays can be harmful as well. And then going this way, not so harmful. All right, so Longer wavelengths are waves that have crests further apart. So something with a long wavelength would be like a radio wave. So the crest here, the top of the wave, is pretty far apart. I don't know if you can read these numbers, but they are very far apart. They have less energy than something with a shorter wavelength. So gamma rays are on the opposite end of the spectrum. Their wavelength, you almost can't even see it. It's very short, so they have a lot of energy. We can only see a fraction of this energy, which is visible light. And then plants use the wavelengths in this range too. So plants use visible light for photosynthesis. So they're going to use that one. So they're not going to use any other part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is pretty neat to know that we can see invisible light, but then plants also use visible light. Interesting, right? So light energy, so longer wavelength, not as much energy, shorter wavelength, more energy. So red has a longer wavelength, so you can think of like infrared. If we go back to this image, here's red here on this end, and then infrared is like below, it's inferior to red. So it's going to be a longer wavelength, less and lower energy. And then violet, very close together, short wavelength. So then you can think of like ultraviolet, which is right here on the other side of purple, on the other side of violet. So that's going to have shorter wavelengths and more energy. So visible light ranges between 700 and 400 nanometers, and all that means is the wavelength, the actual length of the wave. So these are just some pigments of plants. The most common ones are chlorophyll A and B and beta carotene. Beta carotene is usually orange. Chlorophyll A is usually like a blue-green color, and chlorophyll B is more of a true green color. There are some other pigments like lycopene and zeaxanthin, which is yellow. Lycopene is red. So if you see things like tomatoes, or you see a plant with like red leaves, like a Japanese maple, they're going to have more lycopene in their chloroplasts. They will also usually still have one of these main pigments or more than one, but they will have a lot of lycopene, which gives them that color. So that's just something to think about, that there's not just one pigment, there's multiple different pigments. And you might ask, well, why do we need multiple pigments? Well, if we take a look at this graph, you can see that each pigment peaks at a different part on the graph, and so they're going to utilize a different wavelength of light. So if we think about plants growing in the higher latitudes, which would be like towards the poles, so something in like northern Canada, they're going to get a lot of red light just because of how they're oriented away from the equator. And so if they're getting these longer wavelengths with less energy, they're going to need a pigment that can capture that. And so chlorophyll A is really good at capturing those longer wavelengths with lower energy, and chlorophyll B is pretty good at capturing it too. So plants like pine trees that are made for cold weather in northern Canada are going to have a lot of chlorophyll A and B, so that they can capture those longer wavelengths. Where like plants that are on the equator are going to utilize chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and they probably will also have beta carotene as well, so that they can make use of all the available wavelengths. So that's why we have different pigments, just so that plants can capture those different wavelengths. Notice that there's not really anything in the green-yellow phase. Plants are green, so they're reflecting all of that green light. If plants were purple, they would be reflecting purple light. If plants were blue, they would be reflecting blue light, so they wouldn't use that light. But plants are green, and so they don't use green light at all. If you were to put a plant under green light, it wouldn't grow. So just something to keep in mind. All right. Photosynthesis in a plant cell. So we're going to look at, well, hopefully now you know where the light reaction happens and what light energy is, because now we're going to talk about what the light reactions actually are. So let's take a look at a thylakoid membrane. So just keep in mind that this is a very simplified version of a thylakoid membrane. There are multiples of these proteins that you see, and again, this is just simplified so that you can see easily what's going on. So this is a thylakoid. So let's remember, a thylakoid is one of these pancakes, right, inside of a chloroplast. This is a thylakoid here, so this is a pancake. In each of the thylakoid membranes, we have photosystem 2, we have some electron transport chain proteins, photosystem 1, and then some more proteins embedded in the membrane. And then we also have our famous ATP synthase. So photosystem 2 comes first. Photosystem 1 was discovered first, and so photosystem 2 was actually discovered after photosystem 1. I wish they would have changed the name to help us, but you know, that's science. So photosystem 2 is going to have a lot of pigment in the protein itself, and this is where water will be split. So water is going to be split in order for electrons to be released, and then once that electron receives some light energy, it gets excited and it moves through this electron transport chain. So let's remember, what do electron transport chains do? Well, they're going to transport hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. Okay, so let's just keep following this electron here. This electron, now all the energy has been used to pump some hydrogen ions through. So we're going to excite it again in photosystem 2 with light energy, which is captured by pigments. And then that electron will be captured by our electron carrier, NADP, and it'll make NADPH. So now we have these hydrogen ions in the lumen of the thylakoid. So we have a really high concentration. These hydrogen ions want to get out. They say there's too many. We want to move. And so ATP synthase will allow them to go through as long as they help build some ATP. Okay, so ATP synthase is going to utilize the electrochemical gradient and make ATP. Okay, so let's take a look at our products here, or I guess we'll start with the reactants in this in the light reaction. So we start with water, comes from the plant root, and then we also have to have light energy. Okay, and then from water and light energy, we create NADPH and ATP. Okay, so those are our products. So that's what we're making. Those two things are going to move on to the Kelvin cycle, what's called like the dark reaction or the light independent reaction. So the Kelvin cycle will utilize ATP and NADPH to make sugar. But let's just keep looking at the light reaction. All right, so here's a better picture, a close-up picture of the thylakoid membrane if you want to screenshot it or do what you want with it. But let's take a look at the photosystems. So photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, you heard me say that they're proteins. So yes, they are embedded in a membrane, right? They have pigment molecules. So they're going to have like chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, probably beta carotene. They might have those other two, lycopene and xanthan. So they might not be green, right? This might be red, or it might be orange or yellow, but for our case, it's green. So pigment molecules like chlorophyll A and B are going to capture light, and that's going to be transferred to this center part of the protein called the reaction center. And that's where our electrons from water are going to go and capture that light energy to get excited. And then they get passed to the electron transport chain, right? And they help pump hydrogen ions across. And then they go on to photosystem 1, which re-excites that electron. So you might have seen these numbers here. These numbers are wavelengths, and that's the wavelength that excites the photosystem. So P680 and then P700 are the wavelengths that those photosystems will utilize the most to excite their electrons. Okay, so photosystems, all they're really doing is capturing light with the pigment and using that light to excite electrons so that they can move on and do their job. Okay, we're not going to really go over all of the names of the electron transport chain, but just know it's like the same with cellular respiration. The energy, the electrochemical energy in the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions across. And remember, hydrogen ions, they're ions, so they can't just squeeze through the membrane. They have to use a protein carrier. And so once they're inside, that's kind of it for them until they can leave through ATP synthase. So that's the only way that they can get out. So once there's a really high gradient of hydrogen ions, they leave through ATP synthase and generate a little bit of ATP. All right. So can we fill in some more of our graphic organizer? Probably. So let's see. We're going to fill in, I'm trying to look at this. We're going to fill in like this middle section here. So all of these. So the light reaction should go here, right? Can be divided into 2 stages. So the first one's the light reaction that needs to happen first. The light reaction requires sunlight and what else? Water, right? And then water is broken down in a process, and this one's not familiar to you, but it's called photolysis. So it's broken down by photolysis, not one of our vocabulary words, so we get electrons, but then we also get what? Oxygen and hydrogen molecules. Okay? So these oxygen and hydrogen molecules, let's go back and take a look at that. I guess we can use this one. So these hydrogen molecules will stay here, and they will also be pumped out. And once they're pumped out, they'll just be pumped back in when there's another electron. This oxygen molecule is going to be released into the atmosphere. So plants not really going to use oxygen. It'll use some oxygen in cellular respiration, but it doesn't need a whole lot, so it's going to release it to the atmosphere. Okay, well, I showed you the answers. Let's see. Light reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes. They require light energy to excite what? Electrons, right? Which become part of the electron transport chain, should go there. And the electron transport chain is going to create NADPH at the end and ATP. Okay, so there you go. So there's the answers. So hopefully you got those. Feel free to fill in your graphic organizer if you printed one out, or just take a screenshot. It's up to you. All right, so that's 8.2. Now we're going to move on to 8.3. So we'll talk about how the light reaction products are going to be used in the Kelvin cycle. Okay. So the Kelvin cycle takes place in the empty space inside of a thylakoid. Okay. Or inside of the chloroplast. Sorry, I probably just confused you. Chloroplast, correct. Thylakoid is a pancake. So the empty space outside of these thylakoids is called the stroma. It's just like a jelly fluid. And in the stroma is where the Kelvin cycle takes place. So the Kelvin cycle does not need light, right? Light is not a reactant here. All the Kelvin cycle needs is CO2 from the atmosphere, and then it also needs some energy molecules that were created in the light reaction. What is created by the Kelvin cycle that we're really interested in is sugar molecules. They create this molecule called a G3P. So we'll look at what that is, but it is basically a building block for sugar. Okay. All right, so there's 3 steps of the Kelvin cycle. Kelvin cycle is pretty simple compared to what we saw before in the cellular respiration steps. Kelvin cycle is going to use CO2. It uses 3 CO2s, and those 3 CO2 molecules are going to be rearranged using ATP, NADPH, the energy is stored in those, and they will be rearranged into this molecule here. So notice, so we have 3 molecules of CO2. So that means we have 3 carbons. So 1, 2, 3 is here, right? And so if we only have 3 carbons, we need to make 2 of these G3P molecules to make a glucose, because glucose has 6 carbons. So we'll have to go around twice to make 1 molecule of glucose. Okay, so while the Kelvin cycle is happening, the ATP is being used up, NADPH is being used up as we're rearranging these carbon dioxide molecules into a solid form. So that's pretty cool. So we're taking gaseous carbon, CO2, we're taking carbon from the atmosphere, and we're transforming it into solid carbon. So this is called carbon fixation, which is a huge deal if we want to combat global climate change. So we know carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and having it in the atmosphere is increasing the Earth's overall average temperature. If we can draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we can fix it into solid carbon, like glucose, we would actually help draw the overall average global temperature down to where it used to be. So if we could do this in a healthy manner, that would help with our global climate change. So carbon fixation, again, what carbon fixation is when we take gaseous carbon, the gas form of carbon, and we fix it into solid carbon. Okay, so really big deal. So make sure you remember what carbon fixation is. Okay, so one really cool enzyme is called ribisco, and it's one of the enzymes in the Kelvin cycle. It's the first one that captures CO2. So ribisco normally, yeah, it captures CO2, but it can do something else, which is called photorespiration. And some plants like the cactus have evolved mechanisms to reduce the chances of photorespiration. So photorespiration, what it is when there isn't enough CO2 around, the plant will mistakenly capture oxygen and it'll try to fix the oxygen in the Kelvin cycle, which isn't going to work, and it actually shuts down the plant. So photorespiration is not a good thing. It doesn't produce sugar, which is, the overall goal for photosynthesis. So some plants have developed ways to stop photorespiration. So that's going to be like plants like succulents and cacti, plants that like to live in hot places, and plants that like to live in places where it's really dry. They can reduce their photorespiration chances. There's just something neat about plants. All right, so hopefully now we understand what the light reaction does. Takes water, it splits it. The electrons from water are used to move hydrogen ions against their gradient. The other parts of water, oxygen, released to the atmosphere. Hydrogen ions stay there to help with the gradient. Light energy is used to excite the electrons from water, and then the leftover electron is captured by NADP to make NADPH. All of the hydrogen ions that are being pumped against their gradient are used to make ATP, and then these two molecules move on to the Kelvin cycle. CO2 is rearranged to make solid carbon, which is sugar. So remember, we have to go around twice to make a full molecule of sugar. Okay, so I'm just going to say that this should say light dependent. So if the chloroplast's light dependent enzymes, or the pigments, if the chloroplast pigments here developed a mutation that prevented them from capturing light or from activating in response to light, what would happen? Or what would we have, what would occur, I guess, in the plant? So we would have water accumulation. So if water's not being used, remember we split water at the beginning of the light reaction. If we're not exciting electrons, then there's just going to be kind of a standstill in the light reaction. And if we're not exciting those electrons, then we can't get more electrons because they're not moving. We would not have G3P accumulation, so that would be in the Kelvin cycle. Something that would cause G3P accumulation, I mean, that would be like a normal process. So we're trying to make G3P, right? If we have good light, good water, good carbon dioxide, then we're going to create G3P. So that's the overall goal. If the Kelvin cycle, if something happens to like Rubisco, and maybe we're doing photorespiration, we're going to have ATP and NADPH accumulation, so those won't be utilized in the Kelvin cycle. Carbon dioxide depletion will happen if our plant is not getting new carbon dioxide. All right, so let's just bring this full circle. So plants will do photosynthesis. They can also do cellular respiration, but overall they're going to do photosynthesis and create sugar. And then those sugars are stored in the plant for later use. So herbivores, or we can call heterotrophs, right? So heterotrophs will consume the plant, and then they release molecules that the plant uses. So the plant creates sugar and oxygen, which are used by living other animals, and then the animal is going to release carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so it comes full circle. So the reactants of photosynthesis are the products of cellular respiration. All right, so let's just fill in this graphic organizer some more. We get the last few boxes. So if we have the light reaction here, then we're going to have the dark reaction here. The dark reaction occurs in the stroma, and then Carbon dioxide will be taken in from the atmosphere. That's known as carbon fixation, and that's the first step of the Calvin cycle, which is used to create glucose or G3P, but we need to go around the Calvin cycle twice to create glucose. All right. So hopefully you got all that. That is the end of the presentation. There are some other nice videos to watch as a recap on YouTube. This is an animation on like the molecule, on the like if you really zoom in. This is Bozeman. I show his videos a lot. He always has like a really good, just quick overview of photosynthesis. So that would be another good one to watch. But I hope that was helpful.